The following is a presentation of the Women's Football Alliance.
Last weekend showed that in the Pro Division, the battle for playoff seeding isn't quite over, but it all comes down to this weekend on the road to Canton. Welcome to the Road to Canton. I'm your host, Brian Sweeney, the voice of the Women's Football Alliance Pro Division National Championship game. If we saw anything this last weekend, it's the 14 teams in the Pro Division are all battling to guarantee home field or making of the playoffs. Let's look back at the Week 7 scores and highlights. The Detroit Venom put one in the win column with an 8-6 victory over the previously undefeated Capital City Savages. The Minnesota Vixen made sure that for the 10th straight season, they would not end with a losing record when they moved to 3-2 with a 21-6 victory over the Nebraska Pride. The Nevada Storm picked up their second win of the season with an impressive 48-6 win over the Wasatch Warriors. The Alabama Fire remained perfect and also posted their second shutout of the season when they beat the Carolina Phoenix 48-0. After two tough losses in a row, the Mile High Blaze are back in their winning ways with a 42-0 victory over the Rocky Mountain Thundercats. In the battle for the number 4 spot in the American Conference, the Houston Energy welcomed the Arlington Impact, but that's where the kindness ended as they went on to win 60-0. The St. Louis Slam did what they do best, score points and keep the opposing team out of the end zone as they increased their shutout streak to 5 games, this time with a 42-0 win over the Dallas Elite Mustangs. In the game that aired on the For the Fans network, the Tampa Bay Inferno traveled to play the Boston Renegades. The final score of this game was Boston over Tampa 69-0. Alex, we said last week that this game would be over before it even started, and it essentially was.
Well, and you talk about a nice day for the Boston Renegades where they are able to go out and score at will against the Tampa Bay Inferno defensive unit. There were some question marks about that with the teams that Tampa Bay had played previously and where they were going to be against Boston. It's exactly what we expected it to be. This game was not particularly close. Allison Cahill was on full display, Shante Bonds as well, and that three-headed running game that Boston runs so well. It's tough to really compare what Boston's doing to anybody else. The gap between the Boston Renegades and everybody else in the National Conference is as wide as the Grand Canyon itself, and we really see that now. You talk about that winning streak for Boston that just continues to extend and extend and extend, and when you have head coach John Johnson saying in a halftime interview, when you're up by 50 points already, saying that you want to get more bigs involved in your scoring, I mean, that's just confidence, and that's the amount of ability that the Boston Renegades have, where you can start throwing your linemen. You can throw your linebackers into the offensive game and score points on it. It's just amazing to see how well run the Boston Renegades offense is, that even a team like Tampa, where they've had some defensive success this year, were lifeless against the Boston Renegades in Week 7. So you look at what that means for these teams. You see Boston, of course, they've locked themselves into that number 1 spot. And again, until we've said it all season long, until somebody is able to beat Boston, Boston is the team to beat. And right now, I saw on Facebook, somebody asked the question, is the bar too high for the rest of the WFA? Rather than being who's going to beat the Boston Renegades, is the question who's going to be close to beating the Boston Renegades, because we've seen the teams that have been closest. We've seen Pittsburgh, but that's still a 3-possession game. We've seen Minnesota in each of the last 2 WFA Pro Division championships, close, but still 2 touchdown games. Who's going to beat Boston? You look at the American Conference, St. Louis appears to be the only contender, but they haven't played Boston since last year. But for Boston, it's all Renegades right now. And Tampa Bay and everybody else, you look at Tampa's playoff hopes as a result of this game. They didn't lose anything. But with what they have left here in Week 8, where they're playing Miami of Division 2, a Miami Fury squad that hasn't been really good this year. A win for Tampa probably doesn't help them enough unless it's by 50, 60, 70 points, just because of upsets elsewhere in the WFA Pro Division last week, and then especially the gap now between Pittsburgh, where they slipped down to a spot in a game that we'll talk about later. You slip down into a spot, but there's still not enough space for Tampa to be able to jump in a period of transition for the Tampa Bay Inferno. So while their road to Canton may be closed this week and for this season, They'll look at it again for 2024 and hope that the road might be a little more open.
And we'll be right back.
The Women's Football Alliance wants to thank their sponsors. Thank you for your support of the Women's Football Alliance.
Welcome back. For those that watched the Women's Sports Network Game of the Week, you were treated to a special victory by the DC Divas when they came out on top over the Pittsburgh Passion by a score of 44-16. Alex, some people might have counted the Divas out. They proved otherwise this past weekend.
Well, and think back to our conversation last week, Brian, about what would allow the DC Divas a chance to win this game. It was the injuries of the Pittsburgh Passion. Turns out, DC was ready to go. And DC was ready to play football from the opening snap in Pittsburgh. Let's look at some of the big factors. We talked about Pittsburgh's defense. We talked about Dahmen. We talked about Niedermeyer. And we talked about the success that the Pittsburgh defense has had this year, save for that game against Boston. This is as bad as I've seen the Pittsburgh defense since they've come back from that COVID year in 21, 22, or 23. This is a defense that now, all of a sudden, is not as good as we expected them to be. When you have Amanda Congliati, who's able to throw for 3 touchdowns and then rush for 3 touchdowns herself, I don't know what happened to the Pittsburgh defense. It's not something that I think either of us expected to see out of that game. Massey has it as the biggest upset of the season, and for good reason, too. At least statistically speaking, we said in Week 7, every statistic, every metric favored the Pittsburgh Passion directly head-to-head against DC and the Divas. But those injuries made so much of a difference. Those injuries, especially on the front side of the football. The difference between Alyssa George and, once again, the quarterback Marcelina Chavez, evident. The throws for Alyssa George just weren't where they needed to be. They did not give the receivers enough time. We talked about Meister being that leading target for Pittsburgh. It just wasn't enough time to be able to do anything with the football that they needed to do in order to be successful against DC. DC, we mentioned, they've had their challenges and their struggles on the defensive side of the ball. But Pittsburgh's offense, with those injuries at quarterback and at running back, made DC look like a St. Louis Slam or a Boston Renegades defense. They had answers for basically everything Pittsburgh was able to throw at them. And now again, you look at where Pittsburgh and the Passion are. The Massey ratings came out on Monday, where you have all of a sudden now a Pittsburgh Passion team that was in that second spot. Now that home playoff game, that might be gone, because Alabama jumps them for that number 2 seed in the National Conference. Pittsburgh drops into the 3. Can they drop any further, right? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves, because the injury is apparent against DC. They get Boston in Week 8. And again, you're not going to move much if you lose to Boston, but if you lose to Boston by a significant margin, that might start to put in jeopardy where Pittsburgh is going to be. We said last week Pittsburgh is a lock. They should be. But now I don't imagine they want to be going back into that game after going to play Boston this week, then having to play them again in 2 weeks' time, simply because the injuries have made this a very difficult season for Pittsburgh. And when you think of the memory of Franco Harris, that idea of next player up, and the tough, hard-nosed football that Franco Harris represented, Pittsburgh is going to have to put the nose to the grindstone, because no longer is it going to go through Pittsburgh for the playoffs, at least not until that conference final. And so, what answers does Pittsburgh have? They need them, and they need them quickly, because how they do against Boston this week will be kind of that preview. If they're in that 3 seed, they get Alabama. I think that's a chance they could beat Alabama, certainly. But health and a defensive bounce back against the league's best offense, that's going to be a tough draw for Pittsburgh. And then you look at the same side for the DC Divas, people counted them out because of how they've done against Boston. But you look at DC, Congliati started to finally find that string of momentum where she can really cruise into that quarterback role once again that DC Diva fans have expected her to be. They had an offense, and Shaquanda Gainey, once again, if you're looking for MVP honors in the National Conference, you might tend to vote her just a couple of ways, just because leading receiver, 3 receiving touchdowns from Congliati on that game against Pittsburgh. She's elite, and realistically, if you wanted to build a team around her, you could. And so for the DC Divas, where they move on into their final week contest, and we'll talk about it in a bit coming up here against Detroit, you want to be able to build that momentum. If you can avoid Boston, great. But if you have to go play Boston, you want to be able to make sure your offense is confident enough going from this Week 7 success in Pittsburgh, now against Detroit, and then into the playoff contest and see, can the DC Divas return themselves back to that former glory that they've had in years past, right? This was another one of those teams to beat. It was Boston 1, DC 2, and the Divas are finally starting to put that back together.
It's the final week of the regular season, and in the Pro Division, each game will help decide if you get to play at home, on the road, or even in the postseason. Let's look at Week 8's matchups. The Alabama Fire look to finish the season undefeated when they welcome the 4-1 Atlanta Rage of Division II. The St. Louis Slam also look to finish the season undefeated, but are also hoping to finish the season without allowing a single point when they welcome the 0-5 Derby City Dynamite of Division II. The 4-1 Houston Energy welcome the 2-3 Austin Outlaws of Division II. These teams played each other back in Week 1, with Houston getting their first of 3 shutouts so far this season. The 2-3 Arlington Impact look to end the season at 500 when they host the 1-4 Zydeco Spice of Division III. The 1-4 Tampa Bay Inferno will finish their season on the other side of Florida when they take on the 1-4 Miami Fury of Division II. And in pro versus pro games, the Boston Renegades look to go once again undefeated in the regular season when they travel to play the 3-2 Pittsburgh Passion. After losing last week to the Divas, the Passion need a win to prevent themselves from slipping out of the playoffs. In a rematch of Week 1, the 2-3 Nevada Storm hosts the 3-2 Mile High Blaze. As the last 2 Division II champions, these teams are not used to flirting with a 500 season, so even though they both may miss the postseason, they still have something to play for. In the game that will air on the For the Fans network, the 2-3 DC Divas welcome the 1-4 Detroit Venom. With the win last week, DC may have kept their postseason hopes alive, but it has still come down to them beating Detroit. Alex, this game could decide if DC makes the playoffs or if Tampa leapfrogs them for that number 4 spot.
Well, and we talked before, Brian, about the success that DC had against Pittsburgh in their game last week in Week 7. They have another great opportunity here in Week 8 to close out at home against the Detroit Venom. Let's talk first about where Detroit has been. We previewed them in Week 1 when they had their game against Pittsburgh. This is an offense that I think has struggled a lot more than what a lot of people were expecting coming into the season. 20 total points through 7 weeks. Simply put, not good enough for what the Detroit Venom are expecting and what the Detroit Venom fans were expecting out of this team this year. When your leading rusher, Clarissa Tullis, has 380 yards rushing on the ground and then is also your leading tackler with 47, what? How does that happen? That's not supposed to make sense. Your leading running back can't be your leading tackler and expect to be doing well in games. They have 1 rushing touchdown, and Tullis doesn't have it. They have 1 receiving touchdown, and Tullis doesn't have it. And they just haven't been able to put enough points up in games. Their 1 win last week against Capital City, a 8-6 win. They haven't been in double figures at all this year. And the defense, I mean, it's as bad as Detroit has been in quite some time. You hate to say it because you want to respect a team going into a game on a Saturday, but Detroit is not good this year. I mean, you can argue and you can be upset with that, but they have scored the fewest points in the WFA Pro Division. They have given up the second most points in the WFA Pro Division. All of their offensive stats and categories are in the bottom 2 or 3 teams. It's just not a good team this year for the Detroit Venom. Great players on it, but it hasn't necessarily manifested itself into wins. And we've seen that all season with Detroit, where they just ran out of time to be able to build their season back up. And I think they played a strong schedule, which, you know, that's going to be a significant factor in that. But there's just not enough in Detroit this season to be a truly competitive team. And I think when you have a DC Diva team, you mentioned coming into this conversation about whether or not Tampa can leapfrog them. I think there's no chance. I think at this point, DC, you look at where they're at. They played a road game in Boston, and that's a tough ask. But then you have road contests where you didn't have control of your own destiny. You had a road game in Tampa. You won there. You had a road game in Pittsburgh. You decisively won there. All the momentum in the world right now is favoring the DC Divas, and I expect it to continue to roll here into Week 8. It expected to be, according to the Massey ratings, it's expected to be about a 20-point win for the DC Divas. I like that win straight up, but I don't like that point margin. I think the point margin is going to be bigger because I think that when you have the momentum going in from a big victory in Pittsburgh, you look at the offense that's absolutely cruising. We said it before. Congliati with 3 touchdowns on the ground, 3 through the air as well for a total of 6. Shaquanda Gainey with 3 receiving touchdowns last week as well for the DC Divas. This is all DC. And this will not and should not be a close contest because, again, the gap between DC and Detroit and where those two teams are headed is just light years away from each other because DC is everything going right for it at this time. And Detroit, you have a win against Capital City, a team that'll make the playoffs in Division 2, and that's great. And it keeps you from being winless on the season, but it's not a pro team. It's not going to be a DC, a Boston, a St. Louis, a Minnesota. It's a team that you use to be able to schedule those regional contests and build those rivalries, but it's not going to be enough for you to beat DC. And there's so much missing from the Detroit Venom where I don't expect them to be in this game for long. We talked earlier today in the show about how Boston and Tampa Bay was over before it begun. I'd say the same too here for the DC Divas and the Detroit Venom.
Thanks, Alex. And we'll be right back.
The Women's Football Alliance wants to thank their sponsor. Thank you for your support of the Women's Football Alliance.
Welcome back. In the game that will air on the Women's Sports Network, we will see 2 teams that more than likely will also face each other in the first round of the playoffs. When the 3-2 Minnesota Vixen travel to play the 4-0 Cali War. Alex, you and I will be in California and on the call for this game, and depending upon the outcome, we may be at home in Minnesota 2 weeks later or back in California.
Brian, it's a matchup, and we mentioned it in Nebraska last week when Minnesota played in Week 7. It's a matchup that we're used to seeing in the conference championship game. Each of the last 2 seasons, Minnesota has hosted Cali in the conference championship game, winning by 11 points in 2021 and then winning last season by just 6. It's a matchup that I think is going to be good for both these teams to have. We mentioned last week this is basically a lock for that open ground playoff matchup. I expect it to be again as well, but there's a lot of questions going into this matchup that players and fans for both teams certainly have to have. Let's start with the homestanding Cali War. This is a team in Cali that has built itself on air raid offense. You look at where they're at statistically, they're near the top of the WFA in terms of points per game. They're either second or third. You look at where they're at defensively as well. Their defense has really started to come around as well. Where right now they're in the top 5 in defense in the WFA Pro. But then you look at the specific yardage statistics for the Cali War, and they're not where you'd expect a team to be that's that high up in the standings, because you see offensive passing yards per game. They're pedestrian right in the middle. Rushing yards per game right in the middle. Receiving yards per game right in the middle as well. It's odd to see that disparity between the points going on the board and the actual yards to attain them. There's been a bit of a quarterback battle for the Cali War this year between Chantel Nino-Wiggins, who has been the established quarterback for the Cali War, and her counterpart now, Guzman, who has filled in well and has done well. The difference there between the two quarterbacks is that Wiggins is able to find completions and her percentage is better, but when you look at yardage, Guzman has been the better thrower. But the problem is there's a 20% gap between where Wiggins is at and where Guzman is at in terms of passing yards and passing completion percentage. That's a quarterback controversy, really, for the Cali War moving into this one. And who do you start on that massive offensive position? The weapons are the same for the Cali War that we've seen. They've added Ambra Marcucci from the Nevada Storm, who I expected to have a more impactful role this season. She's got 1 reception now through 5 games. That's just not what I expected from Marcucci this season going into it, making that move from Nevada to play for Cali. The defensive side, though, that's where I've been particularly impressed by what the Cali War has done this season. You have 1 player, 7 interceptions, 4 of which for touchdowns. And if you're a defensive coordinator and you have the ability and the depth to be able to say, if my defense picks off the ball, they're going to return it the distance more times than not, that's impressive. And for Cali War and the fans in Los Angeles, that's a major significant part of why the Cali War win. The lone drawback that you can have with this Cali War team, their schedule. They haven't really played anybody at this point. They played Central Valley. They played the Nevada Storm twice. They've played, well, they were supposed to play an Arizona team, but that game got canceled because Arizona had to fold their season. And so the Cali War haven't played since May 20th. We're going to find out on Saturday in Los Angeles whether that's going to help Cali or if that's going to hurt. It's that rest versus rust debate. And certainly for a Cali War team that's trying to figure out who their identity is, that's going through that period of transition at quarterback, the question becomes rust versus rest. If there's a team that they'd like to play now, though, especially with their defensive strengths and taking the ball away, it's the Minnesota Vixen. Last week in Nebraska, Minnesota with 4 turnovers. One, realistically, you could say wasn't Aaron Kelly's fault. Hit off the hands of Jackie Radford and was intercepted by Nebraska. But then the other 3 turnovers, 2 Tashiana Washington Ware fumbles and an interception to Essence Bell late in the contest that allowed that shutout to be broken for Minnesota. This is a team that's been turning over the ball a lot more than we're used to seeing it this year. And I think that that's going to be a challenge, especially when they move into the playoffs. You look at who Minnesota has played this year. They played Houston with some success, right? They played other teams. They played Nebraska well at home, not as well on the road. And then you get shut out twice to St. Louis. And the story of those games, too, and those losses for Minnesota against St. Louis, that inability to execute inside of the red zone. And we saw that a little bit again in Week 7 against Nebraska. The question becomes for Minnesota, simply put, is this. What game, and we asked it for the Houston game, we asked it for the St. Louis game, what kind of game is Erin Kelly going to have? Is she going to be effective? Is she going to make the smart throws? And is she going to be able to be the spearhead for the Minnesota offense that she was in 2022? The other thing, too, you look at Minnesota, Tashiana Washington Ware, Shy Rhodes each get carries in Week 7 at Nebraska. Sarah Roche is the leading rusher for this team in terms of yards. She wasn't on the field for a play. And so there's certainly questions to be asked in what does Minnesota have offensively available to it? Because with how well and how ball-hawking Cali War's defense is, Kelly has to be dang near perfect. And beyond the fumble issues of Tashiana Washington Ware, Shy Rhodes being in a good secondary back role, not necessarily being that lead back, there's a lot of questions about Minnesota's offense. The big thing we were told at the beginning of the season, look for explosive, look for dynamite, look for some really big plays, but we haven't really seen that. Or when it's been attempted for Minnesota, it's been chunk plays that have been incomplete or resulted in turnovers. And I think for Minnesota, if they want to beat the Cali War on Saturday and take home field advantage away, they have to keep their playbook simple. It's Week 8. You know if something works or it doesn't work. You need to be able to go out and run a simple, efficient, quick offense that gives you possession in time of game and doesn't try to do too much. We saw that in the last drive Minnesota had in Nebraska on Saturday, where they try to do way too much by throwing the ball. You have less than 2 minutes to go, and you're throwing the ball on 3rd and long. Run the football up the middle, force the clock to keep running, punt it away, make Nebraska go the entire field. Minnesota needs to be simpler in their offensive game because it's cost them opportunities against St. Louis twice. It's cost them almost an opportunity against Houston. It just has to be changed. For Minnesota, their offense has to be simpler because when they're simple, we see the success. We see the successes to Amanda Dvorak on the passing attempts, those quick little screens to the outside, and she has big rushing plays. We see simple slants. We see go routes for Sheena Sparrow, where they are able to do some really good things when they keep the playbook simple. And until they do that consistently, I have questions for this Minnesota offense and where it's going to go this year. Defensively, they've had a pretty good season. The defense has not, for any reason, been why Minnesota's lost games this year. It's not why they lost to St. Louis twice, and it's not why they gave up the shutout to Nebraska in Week 7. Megan Dixon has been a revelation on the defensive side of the football. Last season for Minnesota, the secondary was the problem. It has not been this year. The defensive line has always been a strong suit for Minnesota. It definitely has been this year as well. But when Minnesota's offense can't take advantage of opportunities, you force the defense back out there, and the defense has to play a little bit softer because they recognize that all of a sudden you need a defensive stop. And that tightness on defense makes it more difficult to play. Right now, the Massey ratings favor the Cali War by a touchdown. That's a score that I like, But if Minnesota's able to keep the playbook simple and be able to move the ball well, using the simple, smart football that we've seen them play at home this year, Minnesota has a chance to win. But you and I have had the conversation, Brian. If Minnesota wants to take home field back away from the Cali War, they need 10 points at least in the give-take department. Just because California and the Cali War, they have the wins, Minnesota has losses. That's simply put straight up, Minnesota has losses this season, Cali War does not. So if you get that flip and by a margin, you probably flip that home field advantage. But right now, Minnesota and the Vixen fans and their staff are probably figuring that in 2 weeks' time, they'll be heading back to Fullerton, California to take on the Cali War once again. We'll find out on Saturday.
So you're saying keep those frequent flyer miles ready.
I would certainly say that. Keep them ready to go.
Thank you. So there it is, the final matchups of the 2023 regular season. Our next episode will air 2 weeks from today, and Alex and I will look at all 12 teams throughout all 3 divisions making the postseason. For Lois Cook and Alex Wested, I'm Brian Sweeney, and we'll see you on the road to Canton.
Thank you for watching the preceding presentation from the Women's Football Alliance.